Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the third and final session of the ACPF Watershed Applications Training. Glad to see so many of you here today. And while I can do live sound effects of dogs barking in the background, the cows in the pasture behind me here, I cannot. So I apologize for that. I do want to welcome you, like I said, to this third session. Today, we're going to be talking about presenting the results. And as we talked about during the previous sessions, really getting buy-in from the individual landowners and other stakeholders within the group is critical. And so we're going to be starting out today with Kent Pena talking about presenting the results, some mapping considerations that you as watershed managers might take into consideration. After that, we're going to break into some smaller, more state-specific groups. And like I said the other day, feel free to listen if you don't feel comfortable being an active participant in those. We'll come back as a large group and kind of discuss that a little bit. And then have three short presentations from three states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa, kind of talking a little bit about how they've used ACPF in their state and some of the considerations they've had. Ann Nardi will wrap up that with a discussion of the National Hub and additional resources that you have access to through that hub. And then we'll wrap up with an evaluation and a few other things. And so I believe, Janice, that there was a poll that we're going to launch here fairly soon. And when that does come on the screen a little bit later on, actually it's up there now, we'll give everybody a couple of moments here to choose one of those four options. And we'll share the results here momentarily. So we're looking fairly good here. I'll give everybody a couple more seconds to get that complete. And it looks like we've got about 30 or so people. So I'm going to go ahead here and end the poll and share the results. And so what you'll see is when we ask to use the NRCS or EPA planning approaches, looks like about 45% are using the NRCS 9 steps of conservation planning. About 14% are using EPA's 9 key element. One person using both, and about 38% actually using neither, which is very interesting. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kent Pena, retired NRCS individual here, and he is going to talk about how we use ACPF maps and give you some tips and tricks. So Kent, I'm going to turn it over to you here.
All right, thanks, Kevin. Good morning, everybody. Give me a second here. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay, so this first presentation is going to be kind of communication strategies and considerations for sharing the results of ACPF. So there's kind of two pieces to this. This presentation will kind of refer back to the water assessment document that I think all of you have been made aware of and should be looking at. So during the presentation, we'll kind of be hooking you back to some of those questions and giving you some narrative and content to possibly assist and help you think about how you answer some of those questions. The other part was that, I think this first presentation kind of, what it tries to do is sort of summarize and distill down some of the successful things that were done and presented during some of those case studies. Okay, so keep those two things in mind in terms of how this information is being presented and why. All right, here we go. So yeah, the watershed capacity assessment document, that's what we're going to be referring to. This deals with, kind of outlining the first 6 questions, which is really kind of it kind of goes from the individual and then kind of works up in scale of networks of people. So when you look at the individuals within that watershed and the capacity for planning and implementing ACPF within it, you kind of need to look at the individuals, kind of define the community. Who are these people? What drives them? What are the constraints of some of the community, the actions that the community members are taking, things of that sort. Again, that's referring back to some of the questions in that assessment document. And then the next level up is starting to look at those social networks within that watershed community. And, again, what drives the members? Is it a diverse group? What are members willing to cooperate on and aware of various watershed water resource problems? And then you take that next step up, you keep going up, and you look at sort of the partnerships and organizations that might be working in that watershed already. What organizations exist to address water issues? Kind of take a look at that. Are they influential within the community? How effectively do they work? I think that was one where, from personal experience, when I started working with ACPF again, and we were doing this watershed in the Southwest, this in Sinawa, I was made aware that DNR had done some eval work down there, so I contacted Andrew Craig and Carl Gash and found that they had done eval and that they had some culverts. So I was able to leverage some of the information that they'd already done. So I kind of see that fitting into kind of that category a little bit. Then what are some of the programs that are different organizations coordinating across each other to implement various programs? How effectively are they working? Is it successful? So again, some of those things, and then just setting some goals, and then again looking at some of the tools and technology that might be available. Of course, this is sort of focusing on ACPF, but there's a lot of other tools like I mentioned. There's eval, there's Snap Plus, there's Sparrow, there's even looking at Russell 2 and some of the things that NRCS does within Conservation Desktop. These are all relevant things to kind of take a look at and kind of see what's going on and being used in that watershed, and how do the people and the tools interact and the organizations. So that's really important to kind of get a handle on kind of those relationships and communication. So let's look at that a little bit more closely now. So we've got, the conservation partners, of course, we've got, the NRCS staff, federal, state, local partner agencies. Focusing on NRCS and the SWCD, or LCD as we call it in Wisconsin. These are some really important folks to get involved. They're the ones who really provide that on the ground local knowledge. They're really aware of just the social and resource economic issues. They know the people in the community. They're a huge part of that on the ground staff that just leverage their knowledge and expertise. And then when you jump up to the federal, state, and local agencies, then you start looking more, who's interested in water quality improvements on that state, regional kind of scale. And they can provide other technical support. There's I think using the example between NRCS and DNR, we've got kind of really complementary skill sets that we can bring to the table when we collaborate together. There's operational stuff, the whole financial support to the community and watershed projects. All that really plays out with those relationships and collaboration between federal, state, and local agencies. Very, very important. And many of you are really aware of this, but those are some of those sort of threads that kind of come out of those case studies when we kind of start distilling them down and what works and what doesn't. And then you've got partner organizations. Those are a real integral part to the success of an application of ACPF too. Again, some of those case studies provided some great examples of some of the roles partners play in applying ACPF. Like Carl mentioned with the Iowa work, one of the real big players in that was the Iowa Soybean Association, which is a private partner. The other one was, Joe spoke about the work in Indiana that was spearheaded by NRCS and the SWCD. The public and university interaction with sort of this Indiana external data framework for water quality was sort of a really important part of that case study. And in Minnesota, the work was spearheaded by a state agency. So, one of the running themes too, as we walk through some of these discussions, is that every watershed is really, really unique. And so each time you kind of cruise into a new one, you kind of have to okay, what's different? What's the same? How do we adjust and adapt to that new environment for different watersheds? And then, of course, the next step is going again from those conservation partners back to the individuals and the communities. Who are the community leaders? Who are the influential people in that community? And who knows who that might be? It could be somebody on the conservation board. It might be, there were some examples of where one of the lead sort of individuals was someone who had a large acreage in that watershed. So they kind of became a tipping point of influence just because of the amount of property they had and how much could be done there. And that can assist just because they start talking to their neighbors and how that works. So that's a real positive. So, who knows who it might be? So you really need to kind of look around and see who the people are who might be able to provide guidance and information and other leadership from that local individual level within that watershed. So I think those people, getting those types of people on board really help with the messaging and the acceptance and how that message is spread. We kind of mentioned already the landowners and farmers, but those are the people that are really, really important because, at the end of the day, when you start doing practices and citing various practices, it's on their property. So those are the people who are going to be making a lot of those management decisions on their property that they own or manage in the watershed. So these are the folks who are going to be the recipients of outreach and potential practice adopters. They're the guys really who are doing the stuff on the land that you might be recommending or trying to implement. And then again, you get to the next level up is that whole watershed community. Trying to find some of the other people, maybe non-traditional nonprofits who may have a role in there. One of the examples that I thought of for this was, I think it was up in Polk County where I mentioned they were kind of doing the whole trout stream thing and maybe getting Trouts Unlimited involved, and because they have a really important interest in the water quality of various streams too. So those kind of non-traditional entities that may have a really, really vested interest in a lot of the things that we're trying to accomplish by using this ACPF tool. I kind of had the same thought, again, kind of using my own personal experience from the work I'm doing in Sinsinawa. I had the exact same idea. Like, oh man, I gotta grab the trout layer from DNR of the important trout streams, and there weren't any there. So I was kind of bummed because I thought, well, I'll be able to do some cool stuff with that, but it didn't work out. But again, kind of look at those other community members that might be helpful. And at the end of the day, that's a big part of ACPF is, having those maps and kind of using that as a common ground to kind of build those relationships and pull together resources to run the toolbox, field check it, and integrate it with all of this other information. One thing I did, so that I forgot to mention the hook back to question 3.A in your capacity assessment sheet. That's your public service announcement for referring back to that assessment document. Okay, so now let's take a look at kind of get a little more into the actual uses of ACPF, because I think this is one of those things that can really vary from watershed to watershed and what their concerns are and who the various entities, individuals, partners that we discussed earlier, who's involved. So one of the first things is, what am I trying to say is, there are some people who start thinking that oh, ACPF is going to keep us from doing field work. That's really not the case. I think one of the really important parts of ACPF is that it really makes the work you can do in the office prior to going out to the field can make you a lot more efficient if you're using the outputs of ACPF outputs. Again, going back to some of those case studies, Kevin in Minnesota described using the ACPF outputs to kind of decide what sites and practices to focus on. Again, kind of doing that in the office prep work before you go out to the field. Other users have used the stream power index to figure out where gullies are likely to be. Again, that's sort of in the office stuff that then makes you you're more focused once you're on site. In both those cases, you still have to go out to the field, but ACPF really helps you kind of focus on and where to look for where the issues might be. The maps you create for this may never be shared with landowners, and that's okay. You can keep them electronically and just kind of use them, and they're just sort of disposable maps that you use on your own. Then one of the next step uses, one of the other things that I want to mention too is that this came out a month ago in some of the discussions I had with some of our staff, that the ACPF results might be really useful for actually as a training situation for new staff. So that keep that in mind too, that they can be used as a teaching learning tool for new conservation staff. So next we've got enhanced outreach and engagement. ACPF can help to just prioritize outreach related to specific practices in specific areas of the watershed. So again, kind of helping you kind of decide where you're going to focus and where your priorities are going to land. One example was that ACPF identified the western portion of the watershed as being particularly suitable for wascobs, while the eastern portion was more suitable for stream bank stabilization. So then you kind of divide and conquer and allocate resources better that way too. And I think one of the most important things with ACPF is that really that promotion of the watershed thinking, putting the field within the nested context of the watershed, where's the water coming from, where is it going, the interconnectivity of everything you do, what your neighbors do impacts you, what you do impacts your neighbors, that whole idea. So I think that's one of the real important aspects of ACPF too. The whole multi-landowner projects, again, that's kind of what I was talking about with the watershed thinking is, having some tools and scientific information that really helps landowners understand that interconnectivity of what they each do individually matters to everybody else around them too. So I think that's really important. And of course, you've got the funding, follow the money. So ACPF can be really useful in terms of, again, it provides a scientific validity to a proposal. It's repeatable. You can kind of justify which practices to focus on and show how many you have opportunities for or not for that matter. So in this case, a lot of that numerical kind of bean counting stuff can be really important in terms of providing added information for some funding proposals. Okay, so now we're to sort of considerations, tailored to the audience. That's a huge one. Back to that local knowledge of practice preferences, that the community leaders might be pitching. What are the existing practices? What are the attitudes towards conservation? Some of those things. Carl Gesch described, kind of determining what practices people would support before they even talked about citing practices. So like a lot of those, those type of things to sort of, again, that goes back to that first part where how do you, what are the attitudes and perceptions of those people within that watershed regarding water quality and conservation. The other one that really comes up is this target. You don't want to put a target on somebody's back, so that's sort of a nuance how you talk about things. Just because something might be lit up with red with being a runoff risk assessment, they may be doing a lot of good practices. They're addressing it. Look at something that you want to opportunities to consider, not necessarily a problem to be solved, but that language that you use, use priority, precision, enhanced. Don't say that we're going to target this problem, because that can have some really bad connotations. The other thing that we really want to reinforce is this whole idea that, ACPF is non-prescriptive. It's not, it's just showing you where some potential, some possibilities exist for where you might want to put these practices. This is where, I think Joe's analogy of the ACPF cafe comes into play, where, ACPF just provides a menu. It's different things that you can order. The conservation staff takes those orders. The TSPs might be these culinary experts who maybe cook it up a little differently. And then farmers, they pick from the menu. They might do a prefix. It might be a la carte, but then they enjoy their meal. And they choose what to do. It's not that you must do this. And field verification, we all know that that's really, really important in terms of, can this practice actually be put there? You don't want to put a wetland in the middle of your front yard, obviously. So you do want to field verify things and both field verify the ACPF outputs as well as with what a landowner might already be doing for various practices. And then there's that whole privacy. You have to be really careful in terms of certain maps and what information's on them, and depending on the scale, whether it's got PII type stuff. And we're all I think we're pretty used to that. So just another kind of positive reminder you got to keep aware of that. And again, this goes back to a little bit to the assessment document too. So now we're just going to look at sort of looking at how ACPF actually fits into the planning process, going from the area-wide planning to the whole NRCS whole farm planning, and then the EPA 9 element plans. There are some graphics that you can pick up from that path at the bottom for the following screens. And these are some pretty typical kind of workflow process graphics in terms of how you kind of loop back. I view them as feedback loops. So, you go back and you determine, first you determine, was there any ACPF analysis done yet in that area? Well, again, back to who are the partners? And then you kind of, you do an inventory your resources, analyze that data, identify problems, determine objectives. And that's one thing that ACPF can really help with. You've got all these maps of slope, runoff risk, drainage, all kinds of stuff. And again, that's not a one-time deal. You kind of loop through it through that collection and analysis phase. You may come back to it after you go to phase two. Phase two, the decision support, very similar, but you're moving down the decision-making tree of what this information is providing you. You're kind of trying to change data, go from data to information, and information is what is of value to help you make decisions. One of the takeaways here too is that there's a lot of attribute information for some of the results in ACPF that can be really valuable versus just that visual of the practice on the map. Then we got phase three, where you implement the plan, you evaluate the plan. Again, I'm not going to read through all those things. I think a lot of that people are knowledgeable about. But again, that whole idea that it's a feedback loop, and as you go to one, you may step back to the previous phase and then go back to phase two and proceed. So it's really like an adaptive, check out your data, evaluate, analyze it, make some decisions, and then kind of reevaluate and come back, adapt as you get more information. So I think that's really important. Then, and I'm behind, I'm gonna have to blow through this. And here's kind of the same logic, but with some nuance in terms of going from that larger area-wide planning to more of a whole farm planning and sort of at the field level. Here are the differences where you can start looking at, what information can you get from conservation desktop? How does this match what the conservation assessment ranking tool that NRCS staff uses? Those are all really kind of important things to sort of see how things are comparing, and are they complementary? Do they contradict each other? Kind of look at all the information that's available to you, so you can leverage all that information in a better decision support system. And this one I think is really good too, in terms of how different parts of the EPA 9 element plans, how they connect to different things. The identify causes and sources of pollution. Well, of course, the maps from ACPF with the stream network, the runoff risk, all those sort of very water related themes that offers in a map are a huge help. Just the next one, management measures and targeted critical areas. Make field assessments more targeted and more efficient, like we mentioned before. Use the practice citing tools to create this watershed-wide catalog of possible practices. I mean, you can see that all those connections there's a lot of them, which means that ACPF can really help in all the different steps of the EPA 9 element plan. And a lot of it's maps, some of it's maps that may not be seen, but guide the decision-making process, really helping build partnerships. There's a lot of ways that ACPF really fits in and helps provide scientific data to support some of these 9 element plans. So that's huge. And again, this is these are graphics that you can pick up from the shared participant site There's a lot of detail in here. But again, you get a sense again from like how ACPF all the way on the left, where you're looking at regional statewide things, and then marching your way down to larger and larger scale from the Huck 8 to the county to the Huck 12 and farm field. It helps build sharing of information. It helps, you may want to do training and support at the state level. Again, it kind of just gives a sense of how the various different levels of government and staff, how ACPF can fit in from these large scale to smaller scale regional approaches. It's a little bit of following the money, the interagency work, how these different tools, ACPF, eval, SNAP Plus, how they complement each other and how they might be work together. So again, like I said, I would grab that graphic and maybe take a closer look at that. And then this is the end of this first one where, this is where the rubber meets the road is, what technical capacity do you have to use ACPF? Really, once you kind of get it set up, it just really requires a moderate proficiency in GIS. I think one really important part, which relates to that knowledge of the local landscape and practices, is that ACPF is a team sport. You need the GIS person, you need some engineering expertise, you need some certified conservation planners, watershed planners. It's a team sport. Then this has probably been touched on before with Emily and Jim G's presentation. It's just all the time it takes to do it, the software, and then at the bottom is the resources that are available for that. And again, you've got to go back to your assessment. Some of this relates to questions 6.3 through 6.I. So that's the end of that presentation. Up next, we've got sort of cartographic design 101. I don't know, Ken, do you want me to just go ahead and jump into that one? What do you think, Kevin? Oh, is Kevin gone? Well, I'll go ahead. All right, so next is this whole idea of building products with map products with ACPF data. This one I struggled a little bit with in terms of how to tackle this for this presentation. One of the reasons is that, just the way that ACP results can be made accessible and consumed today is there's just so many different media between cloud services and web maps, and are you using it on a mobile device? There's just traditional hard copy maps, and the data-driven pages. There's just the tools, the way you can disseminate this information is really just phenomenal, is all I can say. Now, that being said, is a lot of you, when it comes to the map making, you're probably not going to be the one making the map. Really, you're the one who's going to be probably working with the GIS person and collaborating and together to create a map. So this is where you really have to kind of get a base understanding of the ACP outputs and how they can be represented. You've got some base layers. What are the outputs? What are their formats from vector to raster and attribute tables, and how you work with those, and how the GIS person helps you represent those on a map really varies. So again, just become really comfortable and know what those results are and what information is in their tabular data. So again, one of the, like I mentioned, that you probably won't be making the map directly. You'll be consulting with and collaborating with a GIS person. So I thought the best idea was to just sort of break down some fundamental cartograph design elements and make you aware of them, and just to get you thinking about them. So that's where we're going to go now. Is we're going to kind of just look at different aspects of things you need to consider when you make a map, any map, whether it's a web map, a PDF, whatever. These all, regardless of what buttons you push for it to go somewhere, these are some decisions that need to be considered. So one of the big ones is think about its meaning. You know, what are you trying to convey with that map? Figure out the story you want to tell. It's back to that whole idea of who's the audience, what's the media. Like I mentioned, there's just infinite number of different ways you can disseminate this information. But the bottom line is, you know, who's the audience, and what is the objective for these maps? You know, a map is just basically a communication device. So always keep that in mind, like what's the message and what knowledge does the audience have, or so that those two things are really important. You know, this relates to the kind of the next slide after this is, well, what are your geographic bounds? That really dictates you know, the scale of the map. Like, is it a continental wide thing with a bunch of you know, twos, or you know, are you dialed in on a Huck 12? Are you at the field level, field map level? Those scales really, and your geographic bounds really dictate how much detail and, you know, how much detail you can show, or is it being generalized? So those are really important things to kind of keep in your head. Scale. So yeah, just, you know, scale. I think how you word it, and I make this mistake often where, you know, it's this you say large scale when you say it's a map of a large area, and that's not necessarily true. It's really just the scale on the ground of the map relative to on the map. So scale is basically, you know, it's the size of the map and the size of the piece of earth that it's describing. So when you know, statement of scale, it can be an absolute scale like 1 to 100,000, 1 to 12,000. It can be a scale bar. So the easiest way to remember the scale of the map is if you turn that ratio scale of like 1 to 100,000 and make that a fraction, like a ratio. 1 to 100,000 is a larger scale than 1 to 1,000,000. Is the easiest way to, if you make it one, you know, like 1 to 12,000 is a larger scale than 1 to 24,000, because 1 divided by 24,000 is a smaller number. So that's a good way to remember it. And again, the graphic at the bottom is just to sort of show that as at the very small scale on the left, you can't show a lot of detail, but as you go right, all of a sudden you can start seeing more showing and seeing more information because of the scale. And I think with how Google Maps works, where we've kind of taken the scale and the detail associated with a given scale for granted, because with Google Maps, as you zoom in and out, Google's doing that kind of seamlessly, where it adds detail as you zoom in and go to a larger scale. So again, this again just kind of shows the map on the left is a smaller scale. It's the whole watershed. So what you can show on that one is very different than what you can show on the one at the right, which is at a 1 to 6,000 scale. Very, very different scales. You know, and again, this is a really important choice at the very beginning of the card design process. Is what's the scale of your map? And one thing that can't be, you know, when you're doing sort of a PowerPoint is, you know, the map on the right is kind of an 8.5 by 11. The one on the left is 11 by 17. You know, I could have a poster size map that's, you know, 36 inches by 36 inches, and you wouldn't have a sense of that on a PowerPoint. But that's a thing to keep in mind here too. You know, the other part that's really important is just sort of that background. So what's the background reference information to give sort of locational awareness and kind of help the user figure out where exactly am I? You know, and that's sort of like why you turn streets on, possibly cities, you may streams and ditches, there's all these other things. And this again depends on your scale and the size of the map, what might be appropriate. But those are all really important to sort of give the map a geographic location reference for the user. Again, this is kind of a quick symbolization thing. Symbology it can be really difficult. It can be dealt with color, line weight, shape. The graphic on the left shows some very kind of graphic symbols that are an icon. It's an actual tree, not just a dot for a tree or for a tower. Those can be very useful. There's a standard NRCS symbology palette for how different things should be symbolized. That's important from a standardization standpoint. And then going to the one on the right, when we look at size, shape, and color, the first one with the size, a good example of that is where different cities are often shown with different size circles based on their population and their size. So that's you're using the size of the symbol to indicate the population of a particular city. A different shape would be more showing different in kind. Like, is this a rock outcropping? Is it a wet spot? So that's difference in kind. And that's kind of the same thing with a color is similar to difference in shape. So keep those things in mind. A color value similar to
Kent. I don't mean to interrupt you here, but we want to keep on track so we wrap up on time. So if you can wrap up here in the next minute or two.
The legend, develop the labels and text is important in terms of the map title is extremely important. These point sizes aren't really what's important. Those I was just using as a placekeeper, but kind of have a hierarchy. Your font can really affect how the look and feel of the map. Everybody's accustomed to water is italics. So at the bottom, I show some really drastically different font types, where the top two give sort of an authoritative kind of conservative look, whereas the two bottom ones are kind of those would be used for a very different map, just because those fonts give it a whole different psychological impression. The legend, again, the big thing here is if you need to add units, that's very important. Is it square meters? Is it acres? Your legend should really explain the symbology. Consider if a legend is even necessary, if you can label something on the map. So those are various trade-offs. The legend on the lower left, that's just a really disorganized one. It's not very good. The ones on the right, the lower right, you've got the two important ACPF things there together. Then you've kind of got the sections and field boundaries, these human boundaries that are imposed, and then the hydrographic features very kind of clearly associated, very simple, straight up. In my opinion, cartograph design, simple and clean is always best. I think that's really important. Map layout, the whole foreground, background. Do you need a locator map or not? It kind of depends on the audience. Sometimes, oftentimes, a north arrow isn't always necessary if the map isn't rotated. Locator maps can be extremely valuable. Again, that can be audience dependent. And then we will wrap up with this kind of academic graphic that's not too freaky, but I think helps kind of organize some of the things that I was talking about, where you've got the real world at the top, you've got moving that environment to a map, you've got the map maker on the right, you've got the map user reader on the right. The map maker gathers information, generalizes it, puts it on the map, and then the user needs to read it, interpret it, and do decisions and use it. So hopefully, if the map maker does their job right, that person can easily use that map. So that's sorry, I'm going super quick. I did a test run. It seems like pretty fast the last couple days ago. And in closing, before we go to the map critique stage, this is considered one of the best infographic maps. One of my personal favorites. I know the resolution of this isn't very good, but on the left side is the Polish border. This is a map of Napoleon's march to Moscow. On the far right, the beige line is his march to Moscow, and its width is, he started with 422,000 troops. And then the width keeps shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And along the bottom, that graph is the average daytime temperature. So you can see as the temperature drops, even in the retreat, Napoleon starts losing more and more troops. So the moral of the story is don't march on Moscow in the winter.
And
So
thank you very much, Kent. I see that there's a couple of questions, or at least one good one in the chat here that we'll respond to a little bit later on. You also have the link that was in the materials earlier to pose questions during the session as well. With that, we want to transition on here to the breakout sessions. And so Janice has things set up for you. She'll be sending you into the breakout sessions here momentarily. You'll have a facilitator. What you've got is a set of maps to look at. And we're going to go ahead and try to give folks about 17 minutes or so. So we'll pull people back in here at about 5 minutes after the top of the hour. But you've got time, and just look through those maps, compare them, and discuss what looks good and what does not. And what I'll tell the facilitators is that when you get done, if you can pop back out, let us know you're done, and then hop back to your group, that would be great. So we'll let everybody hop to the groups here. Still muted there. So just as a reminder, coming back in from the breakout groups, you'll sometimes find yourself unmuted. So if you are, please mute yourself as you come back in here. So any quick observations or things people want to share coming out of the groups? Not seeing anyone unmuting here. I'll give folks another couple of seconds to do that if they choose.
I was going to say this, it's just public speaking 101, know your audience and what they want, you know, what they want to understand before you go into it.
Yep, I would completely agree with that.
From a practical standpoint, maybe if you're going to address this later this morning, that'd be great. But I'm really, really interested in how easy it is for somebody to generate maps once they've got all of the layers together, but to generate maps similar to those that you just showed in our exercise, different colors, different color schemes, et cetera. How time consuming is that? Is that an unreasonable ask by somebody from the outside?
So I think that really depends on the GIS skill level of the individual and what software that you have access to. Kent, do you want to give a quick answer, but we can also follow up and send some information out as well?
Yeah, I missed part of that first part of the question.
So how easy is it to make those type of high color, high contrast, the good quality maps that we saw in the examples in the breakout room?
Well, I think that, it's one thing to make sort of these, what I call quick and dirty knockoff maps. Those are pretty easy. But when you go to making a really high quality map, that can be a little time consuming. And one thing I would say is that, what am I trying is just because you're a GIS person, you may not be a good cartographer. Okay, those are really kind of two different skills. But making a quality publication is very time consuming, and it's kind of that last 5% that kills you, where you're kind of moving stuff around and everything's kind of a compromise. And if you can, like, one example that I'll give is within our NRCS office. Before I retired, we had a really good public affairs specialist who had a graphic design background. And so when she and I worked together on stuff, that was great, because I've got a pretty decent cartographic design background in addition to my GIS skills, but she brought just a whole nother level of taking what I gave her and making it really good. So I'll leave it at that. It's time consuming.
Yep. Okay, and Kent, before we go on here, I just want to share something very, very quickly. So one of the things that we really don't think about is, can the people actually see the maps that we're generating? And while we didn't talk about this in the examples, I do want to point out that roughly 1 in 20 people, and in agriculture, I found it to be between 7 and 8% of the males I interact with have difficulty distinguishing colors. And so some of the maps that we showed earlier, I thought, some folks that are colorblind or have issues might have difficulty perceiving some of those colors. The best example I can give is that if I've got red flags in a alfalfa field or a soybean field, a grass pasture, or green growing crop, those don't stand out at all. They're not visible to somebody who's red-green colorblind. So NRCS has a very neat publication that looks at color blindness and maps. I just pulled a couple of examples out of that. This one shows the red-green perception differences. You notice the upper right or upper left, field 7, what it might look like on the left to somebody who has no color blindness issues, and on the right to somebody with red-green perception issues. And so types of things that can be done. Here we've got an example of just a higher contrast cross-hatching, but also a white shadow around some of the icons on the map. Little things like this can definitely make a big difference. And so the publication that I reference is one by NRCS out of Washington State, Making Better Maps for Colorblind Producers. And just as a note, for those that are using federal dollars for ACPF or any other work, the maps that you generate do need to be compliant so they're visible to people with visual impairments. So with that, we are going to move on here, and we're going to have 3 different states present sort of where ACPF is in their state, and Matt Drewitz is up first. From Minnesota. And so Matt, you should be able to share your screen here, and we'll give you about 8 minutes or so to kind of go through what you need to. So plan on wrapping up about 22 after the hour if you can, please.
Okay, sounds good. And I will, thanks everybody. Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I'm Matt Drewitz, research scientist, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. I just came over here to a new position, working on the nutrient reduction strategy, and also working with watershed models like ACPF as well. And previously I was with the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources and worked a lot of work kind of prepping in from some of the data, that background data for doing ACPF in Minnesota. So, and so I have a longer PowerPoint. I'm not going to go through all the slides. That you can take a look at some of those other slides later, but I was just going to go through and talk about some of the highlights. Just one thing, just in Minnesota, we've got, we have basically TMDLs and watershed restoration protection strategies that have incorporated those TMDLs, and our nutrient reduction strategy. We have this all covered statewide, and we're looking to incorporate those and watershed-based plans that are mostly on an 8-digit HUC level. And so that information really feeds into implementation work, and especially using tools like ACPF to prioritize where we want to put practices and what are feasible. So we've got kind of a process in Minnesota where all this kind of fits together. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about, kind of the data inputs, how that's being developed in Minnesota that supports ACPF, kind of the tool outputs, how they've been used, and then some future work. So one thing there's a few slides on hydro conditioning in here. It's just really important to have a good hydro condition digital elevation model to support, running, ACPF. And and so one of the things that we've been doing, and Jeff from St. Mary's is on the call here, St. Mary's University in Winona. We've been kind of collecting all the breach line data, basically these road crossings and culverts and things like that, in electronic database. And so if you're looking to run ACPF, that's really helpful to have that information that's been manually done and verified, and that can build your hydro DEM. So if you need some of that information, you can talk to me and we can get that information in these areas. And we're expanding this information all the time. And we've got a web app that has this data, which we can share with the group as well. That's being updated. So we got pretty good coverage in the agricultural zone of Minnesota, and hopefully to fill in these gaps and get some stuff up by Ben's area in Stearns County as well, to more coverage in his area. I've worked, and part of my work when I was with the Board of Water and Soil Resources, I've worked with the University of Minnesota and Iowa State University on the daily erosion project, and we've through that there's a automated hydro conditioning process that's been done, but that's really supports that application. But going back to having these kind of manually developed breach lines and hydro DEMs are important for your projects. I want to mention just in Minnesota, we have our Clean Water Fund, which has helped support actually developing the daily erosion project in Minnesota, and through that we've created all the core databases for the state, and we'll be looking at actually getting this completed up here in northern Minnesota too, because they're going to be looking at kind of the forested impacts as well with the daily erosion project. But just so Minnesota does provide funds to make sure that these databases are updated and maintained over time. And so that core data development then goes into two things. It goes into the daily erosion project work, and we use that for trend analysis and soil erosion at a high level in Minnesota. And then these the core data then can help utilized to running the ACPF tool and then getting the outputs from that tool for implementation and planning. And so for those, I'm just kind of a sales pitch on the daily erosion project, something that we've been working here in Minnesota and supporting Iowa State's work with Dr. Brian Gelder. It's a really good application that takes a lot of this core information, looks at it at a high level, and and it's very helpful for looking at impacts from soil loss, and like here's a good example of a storm we had last year where we had kind of a massive storm come through, and a lot of impacts kind of in the central part of and western part of Minnesota. And so that's just another impact of that. And here's a map showing that in more detail, and you can get that information. So anyway, so I just want to mention that we're daily erosion projects, kind of one of the things we've been working with too. For uses in Minnesota, Kevin Keener and talked about his really good examples, through this training. So that's where ACPF was tested out in Minnesota. So in these areas here, we have a lot of data for various watersheds that were created in the past through state funds. I know Alicia and Ben are on the call here, and they've been running ACPF and Kevin as well, and their areas and specific watersheds. And I know for a lot of our 319 long-term 319 watersheds are using ACPF to develop their 9-element plans. So we're hoping to kind of fill in the gap in some of these areas, especially probably in southeastern Minnesota, with additional ACPF data down the road. Then here's just some outputs like you've seen. Here's some example of just the hydro DEM here in the Yellow Medicine, part of the upper part of the Yellow Medicine watershed here next to South Dakota, along the that area. And so Jessica Nelson, who works at Iowa State now, getting her PhD, she did a lot of initial work, developing some of the initial ACPF data in Minnesota, and created a lot of maps, for the locals to use as well. So that was a really helpful project. It was funded through some funds when I was at Bowser in the past. And here's just some more examples of some of the, like we've seen grass waterways and wascobs, and especially in like this watershed here along the, if you're familiar with the yellow medicine, it's in western Minnesota, we have kind of this break between the Minnesota and Missouri watersheds, and you have it's called the Buffalo Ridge, where we have lots of windmills and there's a lot of steep slopes. And so, having tools like ACPF are helpful for identifying those areas for soil loss control, especially wascobs. And then here's another example of kind of looking at, depressional water storage. And I'm working on a project right now where I work at MPCA to look at in the Minnesota River Basin, how we can identify water storage, places for more water storage. And so we'll be using the ACPF tool in a few key watersheds to test that methodology out, using this data along with other data sets. So just for the future here, this is my last slide. Some of the things I'll be working on in my job, working with our agency partners and local partners, is looking at the river watershed and how we can really kind of beyond and I've been talking with Kevin Keener with MDA about this, about how we can better utilize the data in that watershed, evaluate the fine art tool for nitrogen reductions, and and then just continue to see how this data can be used. And then just for future build outs, we'll be looking at kind of prioritizing where the best places to get more of this data created, and how it can help with implementing plans, but also on the research side, how we can use this data for research. So that's my really quick update. So any questions?
We got time for one question. If anybody has one for Matt. Not seeing anybody unmute and pipe up here, so we'll feel free to type them in the chat if you want to. And with that, Andrew Craig, we'll move on to you for Wisconsin. And so if you can shoot for wrapping up here around 11:31, 11:32 or so, that'd be great.
Okay, great. Kevin, can you and everyone else hear me okay?
We can hear you,
check.
but we're not seeing the screen. So
I'm about to share a screen in a second. So
perfect.
So I'm Andrew Craig, Wisconsin DNR. I work in the Bureau of Watershed Management, non-point source program. I've talked to Matt and others in the past in Minnesota, others about ACPF and others spatially based tools. And I'll be giving you guys not necessarily a PowerPoint, but a couple maps I'll show you and talk about some areas on the map of what we're doing in Wisconsin and how we're incorporating ACPF into those initiatives. Let me get started here. So can everybody see this map of Wisconsin?
Yes, we can.
Great. All right. So this is kind of a busy map, but what I tried to convey here is several different initiatives, watershed-based initiatives we're pursuing in Wisconsin. The yellow areas on the bottom are the approved total maximum daily loads. The blue areas are producer-led watershed groups. The green crosshatch is the nutrient reduction strategy, just like Minnesota, Iowa, and others have. We have one in Wisconsin too. These are the priority watersheds that we identified in those in that nutrient reduction strategy. And finally, watershed-based plans that meet EPA's 9 key elements. We're trying to use watershed-based plans to implement TMDLs, try to focus and implement our nutrient reduction strategy, and to the degree if they can overlap, like for example up here in the Red Cedar Basin, where there's a TMDL, a producer-led group, nutrient reduction strategy, and a 9-element plan, we're looking for overlap, obviously. Once we see those overlaps or other areas, we see opportunities for either creating a watershed-based plan or implementing a watershed-based plan to address these initiatives. ACPF is a tool that's starting to increase in our state. It's not widespread, I would say, in any shape or form. And the primary way it's being used overall in Wisconsin is to use the field boundaries to aggregate spatial data from our eval tool in Wisconsin, which I'll explain in just a second. But ACPF is also starting to be increased in some watershed-based plans to look at to help implement those watershed-based plans. So along the lines that this whole series of workshops and areas have been covering over the last couple of days, which includes the topic we just went through, how to create maps and do outreach to landowners and others in specific areas. Sarah Cusso, there were some previous sessions talked about private examples of ACPF. This is the Lower Fox Basin. This is where a lot of ACPF has been applied to help implement that TMDL and these watershed-based plans, which you can see falls within that. In these other nearby counties, these are also within TMDL areas, and they have some watershed-based plans. ACPF is being used not only to aggregate eval results, but also look at other possible placements of practices, structural or non-structural. Similar along the coastline here along Michigan, it's kind of a similar story. There's some watershed-based plans that are either in development or have been approved, and there's milestones within these plans to use ACPF to some degree to better focus practices and be smart about how limited dollars can be used to promote nutrient reduction or sediment reduction in these watersheds. So this is some of the areas where we're operating with. I'll go up here to the north because many of these watersheds I've shown here in the lower 2/3 of our state align with the TMDLs and focus on nutrient loading and restoring waters because they're impaired. In the upper third of our state, we have a different story, but there's more sediment loading from higher intensity storms, AKA climate change. And this area that's circled here is the Marengo River watershed, where ACPF was used in a different fashion than just citing agricultural practices. It was designed to do a hydro-enforced DEM that Matt was just talking about, and to help produce some more detailed flood modeling results to protect road, bridge infrastructure areas, and follow a simple phrase called slow the flow principles, which is slowing down and retaining water so it doesn't speed up and cause the erosion and so forth. Similar approach up here is working with the Red Cliff Band Nation, and ACPF is being coordinated there with the state of Wisconsin to assist them in using it in a similar fashion in that area. So we're just beginning. It's not a comprehensive approach. Some of these areas on this map that I've described are shown on the ACPF hub. Others are not. As we continue to increase the use of ACPF, we're planning to upload to the hub as well. Short and sweet, here we are.
That works. Any questions for Andrew? Yep. So we did get and actually Matt's comment in the chat is similar to one that came to me to ask here as well, Andrew. So where you showed the map, we've got areas in Northeast Wisconsin that are the Silurian bedrock that are susceptible to groundwater contamination. We had a question about using ACPF in a different context to try to look at management in some of those closed depressions and sinkholes. And it looks like Matt is on the same track there. So any thoughts, either Matt or Andrew, on using ACPF for sinkholes or karst areas?
Well, this is Matt. I can just say I've been starting to look at, because we have, sinkholes, geospatially mapped in southeastern Minnesota. So trying to take locations of practices like that, and then we can figure out which fields, basically on the field boundaries, we have the presence of those. So then we can kind of stack that information with other data sets we have, including ACPF outputs and stuff. So And we're also going to be looking at the field boundary data sets and kind of prioritizing fields for like water storage and other and river basin. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely applications of the outputs from ACPF or digital elevation modeling per se to show internally drained areas to the degree that those can be shown on a map and overlain with shallow bedrock areas to look at potential recharge areas. Definitely an application within Wisconsin that applies. In fact, we have some specific performance standards that we've adopted in Wisconsin that relate to manure management practices based on depth to rock. And it also, some of those standards include avoiding internally drained areas that are recharge areas, applying manure within them.
Okay, excellent. Well, moving on then to our final state that's going to talk a little bit about what they're doing today. And for those of you in Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan, I will say that we had similar presentations at the last training, and those recordings are available if you're interested. So I'm going to throw it over here to Andy and James out of Iowa. And you've got, I don't know how you and Greg Haddish have decided to divvy up the time, or 5 minutes or so apiece. But Andy and James are going to be talking about ACPF in Iowa, and then Greg's going to follow up with a little bit of a discussion on ACPF and CART or Conservation Desktop, excuse me, and integration with NRCS.
You want to go first, James?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you the same question, but sure, I can go first. Let me share my screen then. All right. Sure, I get the right one.
Yep. So if you guys want to go 5-6 minutes or so, wrap up around 11:30, 8, that would be good.
Okay. Yeah, my name is James Martin. I work for the Iowa Department of Agriculture, and primarily in Southeast Iowa. And I think hopefully you can see my screen here.
Yes, we can.
I'll go into the presentation view, but yeah, in terms of scale, that's kind of a thing I work a lot with different groups at the HUC 8 scale, 10, 12. So it's kind of a matter of what we're looking at, at the larger scale. We may not care so much about the level of accuracy or detail and say like a conservation contour buffer strip. But when we start looking at the HUC 12, and I got a couple slides, I just want to show you HUC 12 stuff we're doing to try to narrow down that buffet. How do we kind of get that buffet down to something we can tackle one bite at a time? So we in Southeast Iowa, we've had several watersheds that have incorporated riparian assessments and tillage and cover crop assessments into the ACPF outputs. And that's the next slide here. I wanted to show you the differences or comparison of the runoff risk assessment from ACPF, which you guys have seen a number of times over the last few days on the left. And then, which many of you are also familiar with on the right, is a Russell map. This is a watershed that was previous to the state's nutrient strategy, had a ton of work done in it, structural work, and they were looking at, well, what's left? How can we prioritize from a water quality perspective the rest of the watershed? And so they looked at, say, the runoff risk. It gives you, out of the 10,000 acres, maybe you have 3,300 acres of priority area when looking at runoff risk. But then our Russell tillage-based data has a different number of acres. And we intersect the two data sets using ArcMap's intersect tool. And, we can get a map that looks a little bit like this, where we're paring down from that 10,000 acres down to something that's a little more palatable, where we can identify places to focus our efforts so that hopefully we can start seeing, a water quality outcome in the water quality testing that's done. So, we go from a large number of priority acres to a little bit smaller number where we're just focusing in on this map on the pinks and yellows in terms of sediment and phosphorus, and the dark hashing in terms of nitrate runoff. So that's infield. Edge of field example would be, for instance, the saturated buffer tool. They used their riparian walking the riparian areas to identify tile outlets and bank erosion, and comparing that with the saturated buffers so that they could identify, you know, the saturated buffer tool might have found a number of outlets, but when they actually looked in the field, only a small portion of those outlets were treatable. So that kind of helped, again, pare down, make them more efficient when they're doing conservation planning with individual landowners. And that's what I'll have. I will stop sharing and let you take over, Andy.
And you may need to unmute yourself, Andy.
Good thing I wasn't saying anything yet, but you know, from a statewide perspective, I'm ADSL with the water quality improvement section within DNR, and I support our 319 projects within the state, a lot of our nutrient strategy projects that are housed out of Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. So I work in cahoots with James on a regular basis. We also have watershed management authorities across the state, which are 2080 agreements between counties, cities, and soil water conservation districts. So, and I'll work on urban modeling as well. So just kind of dealing with everybody here. I guess like the big initiatives that we have going on right now is we recently got a brand new spanking LiDAR data set. So I think we got full acquisition and everything was approved by USGS. Greg can correct me, but it was last fallish, late last summerish. So we have a baseline LiDAR data set for the state. I know Dave James, you know, who's doing a terrible job of retiring at ARS. I think he's been helping with getting the P class and the S class DMs updated to the 2020 is what we're calling it, this LiDAR acquisition. And we also have a hydro work group within the state that's basically trying to figure out, okay, we went through this whole thing with LiDAR, you know, 10, 12, 15 years ago. What did we do again to get everything up to snuff? So we're kind of revisiting that. We're back at the age-old question of how do we collect cut lines, and do we use what's realistic for just doing flood modeling? Do we want to go to the level of ACPF and get way up in the headlands? Are there situations where you want to go through BMPs? It's like, so kind of going through those growing pains again. And we also have an initiative to update the field boundaries for the state. Right now, I think it's kind of behind the scenes. The ISU GIS facility has been, they took the existing CLUs that came from ACPF that are supposed to be up to date to 2013, but if you know CLUs and how those were generated and the history of that, they might be from 2001. Nobody knows. But we're trying to refine those, and I'm not sure what the distribution method is going to be like that. But you know, other than that, that's kind of what's going on statewide. I had one presentation we'll skip for right now. It's going to rehash a lot of what's already been discussed this whole week. You know, in Iowa, everybody's always like, "Oh, you're so data rich," and yeah, we're spoiled rotten, but sometimes that's a curse. So. A little presentation shows you how we marry a lot of our like assessment work for land use and tillage and erosion models, like the one you just saw on James's little PowerPoint there, and how we can use the results of ACPF to refine that. What caveats you need to take into account. And it's like, you know, just because you got a data output doesn't mean, or model output means you still have to review it. We have existing BMPs, but you still have to review them. Things change, the landscape's dynamic. So if you just go ahead and throw it in the hopper, you know, you might have a rock in there that might screw up the gears. So when you're making sausage, so that's kind of my little spiel there. So I think we can pass it on to Greg.
Sounds good. If you want to stop screen sharing, and all the presentations are in the Google folder. So if folks want to look at things in detail, you're welcome to do that there. So Greg, go ahead, unmute and start sharing your screen.
Okay, I'm Greg Haddish. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can in about 4 or 5 minutes at the high end here, Greg, if you don't mind.
Okay, sounds good. I'm going to just touch briefly on how the NRCS field staff can begin accessing some of the ACPF outputs within our sort of in-house applications. So I'll just go over that, primarily related to Conservation Desktop, which is our agency's primary conservation planning tool that we use now. So first off, what's making all of this work is behind the scenes at the National ACPF Hub. Josh Obrecht is publishing ACPF results as web services that we can ingest into Conservation Desktop or other applications. In fact, these are all shared with anyone who wants to access them through the ArcGIS Online server. So this is just a list showing how he's broken out all the different feature classes that are part of ACPF output. So things like runoff risk and depressions, grass waterways are all parts of existing feature services that you can ingest into either a GIS application or, in our case, web apps. So within Conservation Desktop, I've published, I've taken those services and put them into Conservation Desktop so that we can share them out with our field staff, both here in Iowa and actually in any state that's using Conservation Desktop. So these are just a list of the services. We made the decision to break this out by individual conservation practices because we felt, and it was discussed earlier today, how oftentimes you only want to work with one specific conservation practice. It might be the farmer is only interested in grass waterways or contour buffer strips. And so by publishing them as individual map layers that they can toggle off and on, that's going to help in terms of their planning activity. I'm able to, I mentioned earlier, share this out with our various field offices. These are the list of our service centers, and then also share it out in other states as well. So right now, we're just kind of getting started with this in terms of ingesting the data, and as more data becomes available through those services that are published on the National Hub, they're going to begin to show up here on our state of Iowa map and in other states. So Josh at Iowa State is working on going through a review process of data that's already been completed. We all know there's many, many HUC-12s that have already been processed in ACPF. And as he goes through those, he adds them to those services and they immediately show up within our applications then. We don't have to republish each time, but so these little blobs of blue that you see here are just a snapshot of where we have some existing HUC-12 data through ACPF results. So down at a closer field scale, this is a look at Conservation Desktop and what our users would look at. Here they've turned on grass waterways with some of their map layers like orthophotography and LiDAR hillshade. Just looking at a full HUC-12, toggling off and on, in this case, nutrient removal wetlands. I think Gene was asking earlier about color schemes of how to display this data. That's something that Josh has spent quite a bit of time on, defining what colors look best for the different practices. So he's got kind of a language of, what the color schemes, line widths, and those things are going to be through the services. So when he publishes the service, the colors are there for us to, or they're ready to go basically. Just a couple more layers that we use, like in this case, saturated buffers. What's the suitability for using those practices? So you can kind of get the idea when one of our field staff is working on a customer's conservation plan, they can toggle these layers off and on. And if the farmer's interested in saturated buffers, they turn that layer on, look specifically at their field, and then maybe take it out and do a field check to see if it's possibility for that practice. All these same layers are available within our GIS software. We use ArcGIS Pro and ArcMap in our offices. So those same services can be brought right into a GIS as well, and then utilized with other GIS data sets that we use in our offices. We've got ArcGIS Online web applications. If we want to share, let's say with the public on a particular watershed, we have the capability of doing that. Earlier, we were looking at story maps. This is a very similar thing where you can set up web maps and applications to share data out to the public that doesn't include any personal identifiable information. It's just these layers that are out there in the public domain. Some internal apps that we use through GeoPortal, which is a portal application. And then lastly here is looking at how do we take it on our mobile devices out to the field. So the same layers that we saw in Conservation Desktop or ArcMap or ArcGIS can also be opened up in field map, ArcGIS field maps. So we can go to the field, stand on a particular feature with the farmer, let's say, and you can see in real time where you're standing and where the proposed practice or possible practice location would be. So that's all I have.
And there was one question, Greg, in the chat from Jim in Wisconsin asking if Josh had published the ACPF Hub hosted services yet, or if that's still in development.
Yes, he has published them. That's what I was just showing you here in these are live linked to the services that he's published. So yes.
Perfect.
Now, there's not very many HUC 12s in there yet, but like I said, he's reviewing a whole bunch of existing data and publishing it and adding to those services. So right now, he's just got a handful here in Iowa. I don't know if he's put any in there for Wisconsin yet, but that's the plan. On the national hub. We'll have the data available, you know, wherever it's been run at.
Perfect. That's a very good transition to our last presentation of the day, which is Ann Nardi, giving you a little bit of an overview of the resources available from the National Hub and on the website. So Ann, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks. All right.
And we're seeing your slides, so you're good to go.
Perfect. So the ACPF National Hub, we have reframed the ACPF team as the National Hub over the years as the team has changed, as well as, you know, who is really on the team, the partners involved. So this is really about what's going on at the hub. How do we, you know, serve to help you in using the ACPF and what tools and services we currently provide. So I mentioned our partnerships here. So we are mainly coordinated out of the Iowa Water Center and Iowa State University. I and Kevin and others are based at the University of Wisconsin, Madison Extension, and the branded programs within that. And then the Minnesota Water Resources Center, we heard from Marcel earlier this week. So those are kind of the main players that are involved in the ACPF National Hub. But of course, you heard from tons of partners from DNR, from IDOLS, from Minnesota and Ohio. So we have lots of ACPF active users. We have lots of folks that are running and coordinating ACPF at the state level that are partnership in the ACPF community at large, as we call it. And really what we function to do is, you know, we have a technical team that's really working to keep the data behind the ACPF, the core data up to date, expanding that core data, and making sure that we continue to build that out and expand into new areas and states and keep it up to date. And then we also have our training team and our administrative team really working to support ACPF users with training outreach. So some of the main players here, in case you're curious, Rick Cruz is out of the Iowa Water Center, and Robin McNeely and Emily Zimmerman are at Iowa State University. Dave James, someone mentioned he's doing a terrible job of retiring. Dave James was one of the original creators of the ACPF, along with Mark Tomer at ARS, and still serves as a consultant. And then you heard from Kevin and others with communications and training. But I mentioned, you know, those are the folks that are at a part of the national hub here, but the ACPF community is very wide, has a lot of folks that are a part of it. Many of you are on this call today. And so, you know, obviously with it being a large tool like this, we're trying to keep it up to date, trying to provide training on it, but we don't do that alone. We do it with a lot of folks that are using the ACPF every day in their work. So we do have the toolbox. The toolbox has always been free and available for download on the ACPF website, ACPF4, the number 4, watersheds.org. I know you've been pointed to that Minnesota handouts page, but just so everyone knows where our website is. So we have a national database of downloadable core data and the toolbox itself. Also just last year, Emily Zimmerman and John Tyndalls and others really debuted the Fine Art tool, the finance and nutrient reduction tool. Currently, it's only available for Minnesota and Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin. Is that correct?
I believe so.
Yeah, I know it's Minnesota and Iowa, but I think Wisconsin too. And so that is a, you know, additional tool that looks at the opportunity costs and the nutrient reduction costs that go into the siting practices. So that was just released last year, and you can find that on our website. It's open for download as well. We also have a lot of user guide, technical document, the guidance behind the theory behind the ACPF, and a lot of those ACPF research, as well as our forum, which is for ACPF users who can ask questions. You know, they keep getting this error. What is the deal? And sometimes we look at that too. A lot of times Dave James and others look at that and say, oh, now there's a bug fix we need to make, and are updating the toolbox accordingly. And we do have a dedicated email for that technical assistance if you're working with technicians or you are one yourself who's running into issues. And then we do training like this one. So we have a technical training that goes into how to run the tool in ArcGIS. And we're looking at doing another one of those in a cohort style online in the next couple of months. And then we do this training, which is Watershed Applications training. And we're continuing to do more of those. We also have a lot of different documents. I mentioned the website, but we have use examples. Those were emailed out to folks for this call. That was the focus of Wednesday's session. We have those process documents. A lot of them Kent went over in terms of how does ACPF fit into NRCS 9-step conservation planning, or the EPA 9-step watershed planning process, guidance on how ACPF outputs work within existing planning processes or existing tools like eval, guidance on engaging stakeholders, like this focus of this one really on making maps and displaying those results. How do you engage stakeholders when working with ACPF? As well as we have that forum for technical questions, and then we have a database of frequently asked forum questions. So, you know, obviously that people can run into issues when you're doing your hydro conditioning, when you're doing the stream network. And so those are important in terms of what are the main issues that you can sometimes run into and how to avoid those pitfalls. So this is a little bit of, okay, so you're going to go running the ACPF, and I know folks on this call are probably at different stages of where they're at, but you know, there obviously is a little bit of planning that goes on. Who are the other stakeholders who are already using ACPF in your state? like if you're from Minnesota, Wisconsin, or Iowa, you just found out, determining where it's been used, where it's been run, where hasn't it, convene those partners at the state or regional level and determine any training needs. The hub can really help in convening partners, and obviously there's training needs. And then it really comes to making sure you have that, downloading the toolbox and determining if you need new core data, and running the tools so we can help with troubleshooting technical issues, as well as helping you train on how to run the ACPF if that's something that your state or area needs. When it comes to analyzing the results, it's really that process of using your local knowledge. Say, hey, there's a culvert there. That doesn't look that way. And then rerunning and updating the results. But you can also determine how those results can integrate into what's already happening in your state. So maybe it can integrate with existing tools or integrate into even CD like Greg was just talking about. So we can help in that process or support in that. And then when it comes to application and evaluation, it's really using the ACPF in conservation planning. We do welcome any feedback or results as well. We do have, if you create new core data, we'd love to know about it. If you create new maps to share the ACPF and have new tactics for doing that, we'd love to see that. I know you shared, folks saw the story map from Iowa. So those are just some of the examples we love to see of how ACPF is being used, so we can share with others and create this learning community. So we do update the ACPF toolbox on a regular basis. I mentioned just last year that Fine Art tool was released. We also have a directory of consultants who can run the ACPF guidance on submitting core data if you created your own core data, as well as the document that was emailed out to y'all, that field staff users guide. So there's a user's manual for the technical tool, but now a user's manual or user's guide for field staff. And we're also looking at other tools to do in the future, online repository of results data, integrating ACPF with Conservation Desktop, as you saw with Greg, and how he's doing that, as well as expanding ACPF into new markets. That's something that we're always looking at, as well as new tools. So we're trying to keep the ACPF up to date, expanding it geographically and making it more robust, and then training folks on how to use it. So all of the information is on our website, ACPF4, the number 4, watersheds.org. But we do have a email address as well if you're wondering about general inquiries about ACPF, or if there's technical questions as well. We are open to hearing those as well. We try to respond as best we can.
Okay, thank you very much, Anne. And so as we wrap up, we do have actually two favors to ask. One is in the chat. If you can type a single word or phrase describing how you're feeling at the end of the third workshop session here, that would be great. The second thing is that there will be an evaluation that should already be in your email inbox. It's really helpful for us, and we made significant changes to this session based on the feedback we got from previous ones. So we really do appreciate everybody's time and interest. And Janice, is there anything else that we need to touch base on with the group before they head off for the afternoon?
Nope.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, I do want to thank our presenters once again for taking the time to be a part of the session here and sharing their expertise, knowledge, and experience with us. And wish everybody a good day and a good weekend.